Hey there! Thank you for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and whether you're a new viewer or repeat viewer of the channel, it's probably pretty clear that I'm really into LEGO and BIONICLE. Now, I get this question a lot on many of my other videos for newer LEGO fans asking if they don't know anything about BIONICLE but aren't sure where to start, how do you get started? And so I figured I'd put together a quick guide in terms of what I think is the best way to get involved with the BIONICLE story, rather than just trying to dive right into the wiki. Biosector 01, for example, is a great source of information, but can be very overwhelming for new fans of the theme. And so this video will be a quick guide in terms of how to get started with the story, and then if the first introduction to the story actually hooks you, then I'll be explaining how to actually dive into the lore and where exactly to find all of these sources of information. It's not like, say, other LEGO lines like Ninjago, where pretty much everything is in the TV show, which you can just go and watch on Netflix. BIONICLE's media is generally pretty split between 4 major movies and then a bunch of chapter books, and the story is primarily told throughout these chapter books. There are a ton of comics, but these comics generally only touch the surface of what's going on, and everything that's covered in the comics will be covered in the books anyways. So unless you really want to have both, I'd highly recommend going with the actual chapter books, which you can actually find online. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just start off this video with an introduction as to how to get into BIONICLE and how many BIONICLE fans, like myself, got into the story as well. Let's go. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the story for this video. I'm actually doing a separate video for BIONICLE TLDR, where I'm recapping every single story beat in a pretty quick and concise manner, so definitely not going to do any spoilers for this, especially for people who are just diving into the story. I feel like it cheapens it a little bit for me to just spoil the massive twist that, for us viewers, wasn't revealed until 8 years into the theme. Instead, I'm going to give some recommendations on how to start off with the BIONICLE storyline if you know absolutely nothing and just want to dive in fresh. Just to give some quick background information, BIONICLE is a line of construction, which means construction plus action figures, that LEGO debuted in the year of 2001. It quickly became one of LEGO's most popular themes and even saved the company from bankruptcy. Since then, BIONICLE achieved great success, especially around the years of 2002 and 2003, but sales eventually started to decline over the years, and eventually, around 2008, the decision was made to cancel it, and it was eventually canceled in 2010, with just one final wave of very small sets. BIONICLE is, to date, the most complex storyline LEGO has ever created for one of their themes, and it probably will remain the most complex, especially because one of the main reasons why BIONICLE sales declined in later years is that to new fans, the story was almost impossible to get into, just because of how complex it is. Think about starting a super complex and crazy TV show in the middle of season 4 or 5. You'd be pretty confused. Unfortunately, unlike many other shows and movies and even other LEGO properties like Ninjago, which have TV shows, BIONICLE did not have a TV show. Instead, all of the storyline was told via either written media, like books, or comics, which were mostly just supplementary and were covered in the books anyways. In the later years, the story got even more complex, with story serials, which basically were just online chapter books, being released online to supplement the story as well. Unless you read most, if not all, of the books and the vast majority of the story serials, you probably wouldn't have a good grasp on what exactly was going on in the BIONICLE story, which is definitely a flaw of the theme, and one that LEGO has been seeking to correct in the more recent Big Bang themes like Ninjago. That being said, a lot of people like myself appreciated how deep and complex the story got, especially in the later years, and actually do appreciate the vast amount of media that we got for the theme. On top of the books and comics, there were 4 animated movies released that covered major plot points for the 2003 to 2005 storyline, and one for 2009. Unfortunately, I will have to say that the quality of these movies are a little bit hit or miss. It's nowhere near the quality of Ninjago, and unfortunately, they're not really that great of a representation of how good and deep the BIONICLE story could get, especially because they were really aimed towards children. That being said, they basically are required watching if you want to understand what's going on in Bionicle. There are books that are written about them, but if you want to actually watch something, that's what the movies are for. I will actually recommend, though, some of the novelizations of the movies, particularly the third movie, titled Web of Shadows, are actually written better than the movies themselves and provide a lot of internal character motivations and details that I feel were missing from the movies. But with that aside, let's just dive right into my recommendation on how exactly to get started with Bionicle. In 2001, viewers were introduced to Bionicle via the Flash game, which was featured on the LEGO.com website, called Mata Nui Online Game. This was a relatively simple point-and-click adventure game which followed the life of one of the villagers who conveniently had amnesia, so you, like the villager, were learning more and more about the world every time you explored a different corner. Essentially, throughout this game, the entire setting of the first few years of Bionicle, aka the island of Mata Nui, was fully fleshed out and explored. You could interact with different villagers, kind of glimpse together pieces of the story as they were going on, and view the world through the eyes of basically just a normal villager or person. This is a fantastic way to get into the Bionicle storyline, especially because there's a lot of mystery surrounding even the main heroes. It leaves you wanting more from the story. I would say that if you play through the Mata Nui online game and you're really not enjoying the storyline or just don't find it too interesting, then honestly, maybe Bionicle may not be for you, especially because Mata Nui online game is pretty much the perfect representation of the depth of the world building Bionicle's got into, especially in its early years. Thankfully, despite Adobe Flash being discontinued last year in December of 2020, you can still play and download the Mata Nui online game as a file on your computer, thanks to a website called BioMedia Project. This is linked in the description, which is basically a compendium of all Bionicle media that's been released so far. So essentially, every single game that LEGO's released, every comic, every artwork, image, you name it, BioMedia Project has it as a full server hosting all the Bionicle content, which is really, really nice. So after you play the Mata Nui online game, the first thing I would recommend for you to do is just start reading the books. Thankfully, again, these are all online. Someone has actually gone through the effort of transcribing all of the books into one massive mega document, where you can view basically all aspects of the Bionicle storyline in this one major document. Think of it as putting together dozens of chapter books, or maybe even if you're a fan of Ninjago, combining all of the TV episodes into one massive movie. This document is essentially the place where you can read through the Bionicle storyline in chronological order, or at least the order that it was displayed to people, so it's a really good way of getting into the story without the twists and turns being spoiled. This is an incredible fan-created document which has compiled all of the relevant Bionicle media into just one major document. You'll notice on the website that I have linked in the description, they have two choices. For one, you could choose their standard or recommended guide, which for if you're a new reader or someone new to the Bionicle storyline, I would highly recommend you choose this one because it only includes the recommended versions of the media. It excludes some of the really irrelevant stuff or just stuff that doesn't make too much sense to see in the big picture. However, if you're really starting to get into it, there is a complete version which has literally every single piece of media. The closest analogy that I can make to this is if you're familiar with the Ninjago TV show. You've got the main seasons and you've got the specials, but you've also got a lot of shorts, and these shorts don't really affect the story too much. A lot of times they're semi-canon or non-canon. Unless you're a major fan, you probably don't need to see those. This is kind of the difference here, although Bionicle does it a lot because there's a ton of unimportant material that is scattered throughout comics and club magazines and whatnot that really isn't too relevant for the main storyline, so they've put them all in the complete version, but I would actually recommend the standard or recommended version, especially if you're a new reader. What's really nice about this is that as you are reading the books, they actually have QR codes that show visual images from the Bionicle storyline of what the text is describing, which I think is a really great feature and gives an added visual flair to a lot of just these regular text books. The other thing that I do finally want to add in terms of the information here, if you're ever reading through the complete biological chronicle, or as it's called BIONICLE for short, the complete story document, and you're confused about something or another, maybe you don't remember who a certain character is or what that name means or what the object is, there is a fantastic BIONICLE wiki. This is called Biosector 01. It's basically the premier BIONICLE wiki. It contains every source of information that even remotely pertains to BIONICLE. And the writer of BIONICLE, Greg Farshty, has even stated on many times that if it's not in Biosector 01, it does not exist in the story. So it's 100% complete. That being said, I would advise against immediately going to the wiki, if only because, obviously, since it's a wiki, it will just spoil everything. So you may get spoiled, certain characters might be revealed as going to be dying soon or whatnot, so if you're halfway through the story and you're confused, if it's like an object or something, I would do it, or maybe you want to read the first like 2 paragraphs or sentences or something and then don't read the rest of the wiki article, because obviously being a wiki, it will spoil everything. But with the quick guide out of the way in terms of how exactly to get started, both via the Mata Nui online game and then the full story document, I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the story, just so people can better understand how this works. Now, at this time, LEGO was operating under the understanding that people would get bored of the same characters over and over again, year after year, unlike Ninjago, which just has the same characters, and as such, they wanted to switch up the characters and the setting every few years. 2001 to 2003 cover a setting called Mata Nui, the island of Mata Nui, and the place that you'll be introduced to in the Mata Nui online game. Over the course of 01 to 03, this told a generally complete arc from beginning to end, although there was still a lot of mystery at the end of 03. The years of 2004 to 2005 were actually flashback prequel years. This featured a brand new setting of a more cyberpunk industrial city with a little bit of a darker vibe. There was a heavy emphasis on this being much of a police state. There was a lot of Orwellian stuff going on in Metro Nui, so it was definitely a bit of a darker vibe than the first 3 years, but also introduced a lot of the elder characters from the first 3 years in their prime as full-on warriors. The years of 2006 to 2008 comprise a trilogy known as the Ignition Trilogy. It essentially picks up the events after the year of 2003 and propels the story forward with a group of villagers now turned into heroes, some of the villagers of which that you actually followed in the Mata Nui online game when they were just normal people. 2006 and 2007 in particular follow this band of characters as they go about their missions, which I won't spoil here, but it's another completely separate location. This is where the tone gets really, really dark. Honestly, in some ways, some people would argue it went too dark. There were a lot of brutal murders, really violent stuff going on in slavery, whatnot, so really kind of dark stuff to cover in a kid's medium, but that was what 2006 to 07 was covering. And in 2008, which is part of this trilogy, circled back on the original heroes from 2001 and followed their quest to basically achieve their destiny over the span of BIONICLE's entire story. 2008, however, ends on a major cliffhanger, and unfortunately, this cliffhanger was only resolved in the online story serials. This wasn't actually resolved in the mainline set content. Instead, 2009 attempted a soft reboot of the theme. Set in a completely tangential universe on a different planet, it followed a completely new set of characters and tried to establish their society as we learn more about how the previous characters from 01 to 08 even came about. 2010 was kind of the culmination of this, well, more like the second half of 2009, where we got some returning characters from the 01 to 08 storyline to feature back into this new setting and kind of integrate their society on this new planet and this new setting for 09, and finally being wrapped up in 2010 with a final battle that was epic in proportions. From 2010 onwards, basically the mainline story had more or less been perfectly wrapped up. It actually does have a very satisfying conclusion, so you could just stop there. However, there are a few things beyond that. Specifically, there are a few online story serials that continued past the mainline story wrapped up in 2010 and began setting up a brand new villain, new adventures, and essentially was a continuation of the storyline. Unfortunately, these story serials were cut short after LEGO didn't really want to keep on putting money into a dead theme, so a lot of these plot points were left unresolved. And if you actually get to this point in the story and you're interested in hearing some thoughts as to where it was going,
I actually did an excellent podcast with King K, who is a lore master in the Bionicle community, really expert on the lore, far more than I understand it myself. We did an entire episode on where exactly these canceled story serials that were cut off halfway through were going, so obviously I would highly recommend for you to check that out if you're interested. And finally, to wrap all of this up in terms of some additional media that isn't really necessary but I would recommend if you're getting into Bionicle, they actually made a sequel to the Madanui online game called the Madanui Online Game 2. This one is a lot more grind intensive than the last one. There's a whole currency system, and it takes actually a lot of time to get enough money to do certain things and unlock certain areas. Some people can see it as a little bit tedious. It takes, at a time, if you're playing it infrequently, weeks or months to complete. It's a really big game for being a Flash game. Still, it's a really great way to immerse yourself in the world from the eyes of a villager, so it's a pretty good tangential story content to 2003, although it definitely could be skipped and you really won't miss too much. They also did a Voya Nui online game, which focused around the setting for 2006. Unfortunately, this one was a lot more combat-centric, played out more like a board game, wasn't really the best game out of all of them, so a lot of people do skip this one. It doesn't actually give you anything to the story, and it actually contradicts some stuff in canon. It's only semi-canon, so really only do that if you really love the 2006 storyline and want to get involved in it. As far as all the other Flash games, you can probably skip all of them. They're basically just meaningless mini-games, so you don't really need to see all of those. They also had a set of animations to go alongside the storyline, particularly within the earlier years. These animations basically cover content that was fully covered in the chapter books, so you really don't need to actually see them if you've already read the chapter books. That being said, if you actually want to watch the events happening before your eyes visually, they are a way to do that. They had the Borak animations, the Borak Call animations, which cover 2002 and the first half of 2003. And then they also had some stuff like the Vaki animations, which were basically just promotions for these sets, but they do a good job of setting the stage of the very dark and dystopian world of Metru Nui, which you can see some on screen right here. That's for the 2004 storyline. And then we have some of the 2005 animations. Honestly, wouldn't really recommend these. They're canon, but they don't really cover anything majorly important. Honestly, you'll get most of the 2005 story content in the books and the movie anyway, so I mean, you can watch it if you really want to. I wouldn't really recommend it unless you're really a diehard fan. And you also have the 2006 animations, which are only semi-canon and really don't tell too much in terms of the story. A lot of stuff that they present are just flat out not canon, and you're far better off reading the books.
Well, with that, we've about summed up all of the different ways to get involved with the Bionicle storyline, from starting off with the Madanui online game to diving deep into the story with chapter books and story serials. I hope that you found this video useful, and thank you all for tuning in. Stay tuned for the future, where I'll be working on many other videos like this. In particular, I'll be doing a Bionicle TLDR video, where I summarize the story with a ton of spoilers, but to make it easy to understand for the beginning user. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you all for tuning in to Duckbricks. Stay tuned for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.